How frightening is it to imagine 4 decades of war? 4 decades of fear derived from a political concept, and of wondering when one of the most powerful countries in the world will use nuclear weapons against your homeland. Contrary to a typical war, the Cold War that occurred on the heels of World War II between 1945 and 1989 did not consist of gunfire and bombings between the two main enemy countries involved. This unusual war was fought by the United States and her NATO allies against the Soviet Union, and was given its name because it did not have the physical confrontations of the average war. Do not be fooled, though. This over 40-year-long war was a time of unforgettable fear, desperation, and confusion. The fear of and aversion to the growth of communism in Eastern Europe is one of the main factors that led to the Cold War. The two main parties involved in this war were the United States and the USSR, who were the two largest superpowers of the world during this time. After the death of Vladimir Lenin, who founded the Soviet state, Joseph Stalin led the Soviet Union and forcefully spread communism throughout Europe. As the USSR seemed to spread her political doctrine of communism at a discouraging rate, U.S. officials grew fearful that Russia and her following nations would grow more powerful than America and her NATO allies. Other occurrences of this time also made American officials concerned that the USSR was forcing communism onto other countries in Eastern Europe in efforts to gain both territory and power. As the Soviet Union grew more powerful and communism continued to spread, the United States developed a foreign policy known as containment. This policy was inspired by diplomat George Kennan's political beliefs that he explained in his lengthy 8,000-word telegram, which is often referred to as the Long Telegram. According to Kennan's advice, the United States needed to act quickly and do all she could to limit the reach of communism to the USSR. President Truman adopted the policy of containment in 1947, and under its influence, an array of policies like the Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, Berlin Airlift, and North Atlantic Treaty Organization were created. These foreign policy plans offered financial, military, and political assistance to any European country if the country agreed to help the United States stop communism from spreading beyond the USSR. These assistance plans spread the American dream of free society and free market beyond U.S. soil. And though such policies are technically no longer in effect today, the impact they made during the Cold War still exists in parts of Europe. At the time, though, these policies did not seem to slow the growth or escalation of tensions and fears, and the United States and USSR eventually entered into the famous 4-decade-long Cold War in the mid-20th century. At its core, the Cold War was not much more than a nuclear arms race. As communism spread throughout Eastern Europe and eventually reached Cuba, the United States and her NATO allies decided they had to intervene. Fear in American citizens grew exponentially when the reach of communism spread to Cuba, and USSR missiles were lingering only 90 miles away from U.S. shore in the 1960s. This eventually was titled the Cuban Missile Crisis, and put President Kennedy and the committee he created for this situation, XCOM, into a frenzy. The U.S. continuously sent U-2 spy planes to gather information on the missiles, while XCOM toiled over whether to react with action or an immediate missile strike. Eventually, this ended with Kennedy's decision to place a naval blockade on Cuba, which limited USSR's ability to offer military aid to Castro and continue spreading communism throughout the nation. Another characteristic of the Cold War is that the upper hand seemed to swap back and forth between the U.S. and USSR. When the United States would invent or improve upon a weapon, the USSR would respond by doing the same. America was constantly inventing and improving her missiles, nuclear bombs, plane inventory, and military populations, but Russia was doing the same. And while neither the U.S. or the Soviet Union ever engaged in physical conflicts directly with one another during this time, it was a long period of fear and nervous tension for both political officials and everyday citizens. The Cold War did not end until the fall of the USSR, between the late 1980s and early 1990s. With George H.W. Bush as president, the U.S. had a leader in place whose years of experience with foreign policy prepared him to oversee the ending of this horrible era. Yet even though the Cold War ended then, our world still seems to live in a pretty constant small-scale Cold War. Obviously, the fear today's wars are centered around is no longer the spread of communism. But modern issues such as terrorism have undoubtedly taken its place and continuously prolonged that familiar state of fear, desperation, and confusion. Just as the pattern was during the famous Cold War, whichever country has made the latest and greatest improvement in its weapons seem to hold great power in their hands.